Okay, so welcome to the first attempt at a Woodworkers Club of Houston monthly video. And what we're going to try and show you here is a little bit of the joinery associated with this upholstered bench right here. So there's the bench, and when I sketched this bench up, the sketch came together pretty quickly, but I wanted these legs to be angled outwards the way that you can see them. And the tricky part of that is how to make the joinery at the corners. So that's mostly what this video is going to be focused on, is how to make the joinery. So here's a close-up of the joinery, and this is the finished product that you get with the dowel joints, and you'll notice that the joint is all closed up and it looks really neat. And that was one of the reasons I opted for dowel joints rather than mortise and tenon. You can do this obviously with a mortise and tenon, but you've got to get all the angles correct, and especially getting all the angled cheeks cut correctly on a tenon and having it then fit as well as this does, that's difficult versus just making one straight angled cut to get the precision of the dowel joint. That's why I opted for dowel joints and not mortise and tenon. This is the doweling jig, and it's basically a square block of aluminum. It's got 5 dowel hole positions in it. It has a check mark at each end. Those can be used as a reference end of the jig. This face, which doesn't have the clamps on it, is the reference face of the jig. And the idea of when you use this is you line up the reference end with the reference end of the piece you're making the joint in. You place the reference side of the jig against the reference side of the piece that you're making the joint in. Clamp it down, drill the holes that you need. I'm going to demonstrate this with a simple right angle joint because a demonstration is worth a lot of words. Okay, so here are the 2 pieces that I'm going to join at right angles just for a demonstration. There's a face on one of these joints that is going to be fitted to each other. I marked those as a reference face. There is another 2 faces that are also going to be references. These are going to match up in the finished joint. These are going to match up in the finished joint. I'm going to be drilling my holes here and here. So I've now marked an X on the faces that are going to be drilled, and I've marked the 2 reference faces on each piece of wood that are going to match up to the reference faces or the reference end of the jig. So here is the first piece clamped in the vise, and we're going to be drilling holes in the end of this piece. We take the jig. The reference side of the jig goes against the side of the piece that we mark the reference mark on, and we line up the reference end of the jig with the other reference mark on the piece, and we clamp it in position. Now, this is a fairly wide piece. I'm going to drill 3 dowel holes in this piece to make the joint. So I'm going to be using the 2 end holes on the jig and the middle hole on the jig. This jig has 5 holes. So okay, so I'm in position, lined up with the end, reference face, clamp to reference face. I'm going to drill 3 holes. So here is the second piece positioned in the vise, reference face, reference end, the end side that we're drilling the holes in. Jig goes in position, reference end aligned to reference end, reference face against reference face, and we clamp it down. And we drill 3 holes. So here is the dowels placed into one of the pieces. Second piece, position it together, tap it home, there's your joint. It's that easy with the jig. So here is one of the pieces with the 3 dowels in position. The second piece, reference to reference, so that, and there is the joint fitted together. It's that easy once you figure out how these dowel joints work. The trick is now how to do that with an angled joint, and that's what the rest of this video is going to be about. So just to point out that you can do this without the fancy pre-made jig, here's an example of a wooden version. This is from Fine Woodworking in January, February 2021. Here's the reference piece of wood, a nice square piece of wood with the holes drilled in it. In this case, they are putting a piece on the end that allows you to locate it. I would be more inclined for what I was doing to put it on the side so that it locates it the correct distance from my reference face, because lining up the ends is pretty easy. However, you can do this with wood. There's nothing magical about having the pre-made metal jig. So here's the example of how you would drill the first set of holes. Notice that it's marked back, it's marked outside. These are equivalent to our X's and check marks that we were putting on there. And here is the setup for drilling the end holes. Similar principle. Point is, you can make your own jig if you don't have one. Okay, so before we start any angle joinery on this, what we want to do is make all of the pieces milled to finished size and the rails and legs cut to an approximate length, but not to the exact length with any angles on them. While we're making the leg blanks, here's my spare leg that I made for the bench out of walnut. Make also a piece like this. This is a piece of Baltic birch plywood with a couple of pieces of poplar glued to each side of it, so that I can run it through the planer to thickness it to exactly the thickness of the leg. And this is important because we're going to use this to make some angled wedges that will set the angle of the holes correct to make the joinery that we want when we drill the holes in the legs. So I am going to show you how I did the setup for the compound angles, and then I'm going to show you an alternative that you could use if you don't have a gauge with accurate angle markings like the Ingra gauge here. We want a 3.5 degree angle for this project. So I loosen the clamps and I set to 3.5 degrees. And I tighten the clamps back down. That sets my angle to 3.5 degrees. I take one of my rail pieces in which I have already drilled the holes. The reason I've already drilled the holes is I can drill the holes straight as long as the end of the piece is still square. Then I cut the angle. It shortens the depth of the holes a little bit, so you have to adjust that later, but this way you get the holes accurately in the right place. Don't try to drill holes after you've cut angles. I'm not going to cut any angle joints here, but if I was going to, I would make my first angle cut. Now, for the legs, I have to have a compound angle. And in order to set that compound angle, I am going to raise the saw blade sufficiently that I can see and tilt it. So I'm going to raise and tilt so that you can see what's going on. And in order to make sure the angles are exactly the same, rather than using any kind of a mitre gauge or anything else to set this angle, I use the piece that I've already cut to set the angle. That way I can pretty much guarantee that if I make a mistake on setting this angle, I make the same mistake on setting that angle, and as long as they're close, it doesn't really make all that much difference. In fact, they'll both be exact unless I make a really foolish mistake over here. But if you're using a homemade fence and jig, which I'll show in just a second, this way guarantees that both of your angles are the same. And that's important for having the legs all line up the way you want them to. There we go. Okay, one of the things that I find important here, because I get confused with some of these angles, and especially when they're compound angles, is mark the angle on all four faces at both ends. Now you can see I've cut the marks off at this end because this is an already pre-made leg. But mark the angles, cut one end, and then make sure that the lines on the other end are well inside where your cut line's going to be so you can always see them. And that gives you a reference so that you make sure you put it back into the saw the right way round when you cut the second end. Let's assume I have already cut one end with the compound angle on my leg. I am lining up my marks so that this line angles with the blade, this line angles with the miter gauge, and that guarantees that I will get the correct angle cut when I make the second end cut. Without these marks, it's very easy to get confused. You cut one end on all of the legs, get the stop block set to cut the second one correctly, and then cut all of the legs before doing any fancy hole drilling. If you don't have an Incra gauge, you just do it the old-fashioned way. Here's a straight piece of wood that I can attach to my miter gauge as an auxiliary fence. Just by 2 screws. Tighten it down. Slide it into the miter gauge slot. Loosen up the gauge and adjust it to the desired angle. I'm not going to precisely do that for this demonstration. And you would then do what you did before. You cut one end of the piece or a dummy piece to the first angle, set the compound angle off of the cut end of the piece, and then you're ready to just use this by clamping a stop block somewhere in position on the auxiliary fence. It works exactly the same way as the Incra gauge. All it needs is a straight piece of wood and a couple of screws and a stop block and a clamp, and you're ready to go. So here is my practice rail piece that I've already made. What are the steps here? Number one, you drill the dowel holes while the end is still square so that it's easy to set up the jig. Then you cut the angle on one end. Then you set up the length correctly and you cut the second angle. Don't cut the bottom rail second end yet, only the top rails. And the reason you want to do it that way is that if you get one of them slightly wrong, the joinery is not going to go together right. So you want to clamp the thing together with the top rail in position before you cut the second end of the bottom rail. That's very important in terms of making life less frustrating down the line. The other thing that we need, here's where we go to our plywood laminate piece that we made that's the same thickness as the legs. With the saw blade set to 90 degrees, we make an angled cut at the same 3.5 degrees, and we cut a wedge off of the side of that piece. You then take the miter gauge out completely and you make a rip cut to get the second 3.5 degree wedge. You've now got two 3.5 degree wedges. These have two purposes. Number one, they let us set up the jig, the doweling jig, to get the right angle drilled in the legs. Number two, they make clamping blocks when we get ready to put the whole thing together. So they have a dual purpose. So here's my two practice legs set up so that they're leaning towards each other the way that they're supposed to, and they're also leaning towards me. This would be one end of the bench as you're looking at it. Now, I'm going to lay these down so that my legs are now laying flat on the bench, angled in towards each other. I am going to take my now top piece, to make sure I've got the top piece, my top piece that's been pre-cut, and I am going to get it ready to be put in position. They will going to be reused. Okay, there it is with the dowels in. Now, let's look at how these jigs are going to work. I am going, if you look at the way the geometry is going to work here, the holes that locate this rail have to be the same distance from the outside face of the leg. But they are not, the distance from the outside face of the leg on this particular piece is not the same as the distance from the inside face of the leg. What that means is that when you start positioning your jigs, you have to position them so that the holes come out in the right place. And I think you can see what that implies here is that you need what amounts to a left hand and a right hand piece. It's entirely because the holes are not going to come out straight in the middle of this piece. And the reason that they're not going to be completely in the middle is to do with ease of using the jig when you drill the holes. And I'll show you why that is in just a little bit. So there's going to be a left hand and a right hand piece. That's why we need two wedges, but it's also extremely useful to have two wedges from the point of view of clamping blocks. Okay, now the result of what I was just talking about is that each leg effectively has an A face and a B face. A left and a right hand end as you look at it, if you will. And therefore there is going to be an A jig and a B jig. So I mark the jigs the same way as I mark my faces, so that whenever I drill a B face on the leg, I'm using the B jig. Whenever I drill an A face, I'm drilling an A jig. Every leg has an A face and a B face. Okay, so now we're going to drill some holes in the legs, or at least show how we would drill the holes in the legs. And in order to make this easy, this jig comes with several pre-made spacers. So we choose the spacer that's going to position our holes the closest to the middle of the leg that we can. That's what I chose in this case. You could position it anywhere you wanted to. Now, because the spacer is a fixed size, it makes it easy to set up the jig to drill the holes in that position. So the fact that those holes then do not come out exactly in the middle of the leg doesn't matter for any functional purpose or aesthetic purpose. So I went with the easy approach. We take one of our wedge jigs. This is the A jig because I'm drilling the A side of the leg. If I show you the B jig, here's the B jig. On the A jig, the holes are closer to this edge. On the B jig, they're closer to this edge. This is the outside edge of the leg in each case, but one of them's the A face of the leg, one of them's the B face of the leg. We position the jig in position, line it up with the end of the piece that we're drilling. Okay, so we position the jig Now, another thing to keep in mind about these wedge jigs, they don't only have a left and a right A and B side, they also have a top and a bottom. Because the holes that you drill with the drig are perpendicular to this face of the jig, to its top face. They are not perpendicular to the bottom face. So you need to make sure every time this goes back in position, this wedge, that its reference side is against the reference side of your leg, and that its top face is actually on the top. That way the holes always come out correct. You drill the first 2 holes. In this case, I drilled holes in the first 2 positions. But now you need to position the second rail. And to position the second rail, the way I positioned the second rail was loosen the jig, slide it down, put the first rail piece in position. I wanted a 2-inch gap between the bottom of one rail and the top of the other rail. So I mark that 2-inch distance on the jig. I position the doweling jig on that 2-inch line. And I don't care if it's 2 inches minus 1/100 of a millimeter, as long as it's within the width of the pencil line. You take the top rail back out and you use this device right here allows you to set a reproducible distance. So you insert this in the first hole that you drilled, position it against the end of the jig, and tighten it down. Now if you're doing this with the wooden jig, I would just make a little stop block that fitted against the end and that was cut to the right length so that you could just reposition it. You don't want to be doing any measuring except on the first piece that you make. That positions the jig in the correct position. So the next time I want to position it, all I have to do is slide it down, butt it up against that, and my holes on all the other legs, I drill one side, I have to make a measurement. All the other sides, I just position it against the stop. And then I drill my second 2 holes. And I repeat that all the way around the legs so that all of the leg holes are drilled. Now we've got the issue of fitting the rails and getting the bottom rail cut to the correct size. So at this stage, we have got a top rail cut to length, we've got all of our holes drilled in the legs, and we have fitted the top rail in position and clamped it in position. Notice the use of our wedge jigs in order to function as clamping blocks. Now we have to get the bottom rail to exactly the right size. And the way I did this was as follows. I put 2 dowels in order to hold this in position. And I just hold it at about the right height. And you measure, I wanted my 2-inch gap. So I measured my 2-inch gap between the top and the bottom at both ends. Like so. When I was happy that I'd got my 2-inch gap correct, I marked my cut line on the other end. And then I basically was very cautious in sneaking up to that line on the first cut. Make every cut by using the stop block on the miter gauge so that you can reproduce it, but sneak up on it, because if you get this one wrong, you've got to throw the piece away and start over. And that's why I don't cut this second end until I can clamp together and be sure that I've got everything fitted to the extent that it can be fitted up to that point. So it's a trial and error process to fit that bottom rail in position, and that's why you start by having spare pieces of wood. This is the spare bottom rail that I made. You can see it's got holes drilled already in both ends. So you take it as far as you can in the construction process. It's got the angle though only cut on one end, because as it turned out I got it right without having to try to use this piece. But if I had made a mistake, my fallback would have been to use this piece in place of one of the other rails that had already been used. Sometimes you can make your test piece out of scrap. It was more convenient for me to have an extra piece of walnut in this case. Once it's all fitted, you check that it clamps together correctly. And there is a practice piece. This is the piece I built before I built the bench to make sure I had figured everything out. And it goes together pretty nicely. as did the final bench. Now there's one small detail to keep in mind here. The positioning of the rail on the legs, you want to be such that it meets the leg at this outside, at the outside edge of the rail, because you want to be able to, just with a block plane, trim it off so that you get a nice flat surface for the eventual screwing down of the top. Okay, so just to finish out, let's talk a little bit about the upholstery part of this. The top of the bench is 1 inch thick, made out of a piece of 1/4 inch birch plywood laminated to a piece of 3/4 inch birch plywood. The 1 inch is just to give it some strength, and it came out pretty sturdy with that thickness. The top is screwed on, 14 screws. The blocks that are the glue blocks, the blocks are glued to the walnut frame and then screwed through to the top. It has 2 inches of foam, and over the foam, if I demonstrate it this way, over the foam is laid some fiber backing so that you can, as you staple it down, you can pull this and it helps to hold the foam in place. You glue the foam to the top, and the glue that you use is this stuff. You glue the foam to the top with this foam adhesive. You glue the batting to the foam so that everything stays together as a single piece while you're messing around with it. If you don't do that, it slides around all over the place. My wife made a seam at each one of these corners. If you can zoom in on that a little bit, you probably can see that it makes a pretty neat job of the corner if you just make a seam. The other advantage of doing a seam at the corner is that it helps when you pull it into position for the first time. The fact that there's already a pre-made corner there helps lock it in position over the foam, and it really works pretty well. And then for the rest of it, you start in the middle, you pull it, and we did this. You can see that the upholstery goes to the frame, but it doesn't come through the frame on the other side. So all of the staples that are holding the upholstery down, we hid under the frame when we did this. It's a 2-person job. You can't do the upholstery part, in my opinion, on your own. You might if you're an expert, but it took 2 of us and it worked pretty well. Start in the middle, stretch it out towards the corners, stapling as you go, leaving, stopping a couple of inches shy of each corner. Do the same thing on all 4 sides, and then come back, and as you fold the corners over, you cut out any excess so you don't end up with too much thickness here. Right at the very corner, you inevitably have 3 thicknesses, but you can avoid having more than 2 anywhere else if you do it this way. So it comes out fairly flat. And by finishing the edge of it off under the frame, the whole thing looks pretty neat, even if you look at it from the bottom.